If you've seen my recent sewing plans video, you might remember me talking about wanting to make a quilted jacket using my larger linen scraps that are left over from making clothing. That is exactly what I'm going to be doing in this video. Each of these pieces is not quite big enough to make a shirt out of, but they are all pretty big pieces. I think the colors go really well together, and by combining them, I'll have enough fabric to cover the outside of a jacket. I wasn't sure how I wanted to arrange the colors, so I started by sketching out a few ideas to see how they would look. One is random and patchy, the other is made up of horizontal stripes. While I was deciding between these two ideas, a suggested post came up on my Instagram feed, with a quilted jacket made out of linen, arranged in curved shapes that resemble hills or mountains. The creator is called Thread and Sprout. She sells these jackets for $600 to $1,000 US, which is more than I can afford. But I love the design and decided to try making something similar myself. For the pattern, I modified the olive jacket, which is a free pattern by Mood Fabrics that I've made before. I cut out the batting, then drew curved lines across my pattern pieces and cut them out. I added seam allowance while tracing these lines onto my linen pieces. I was a bit nervous about sewing all of the curved lines, but it turned out to be easier than expected. I only had to rip out one seam. Once the curves were sewn together, I laid the pieces on top of the batting and laid those on top of the lining fabric. I then cut out the pieces. For the lining, I'm using a cozy cotton flannel. This is the same fabric that I used to line my olive jacket, and I had just enough left over for this project. I then quilted along the seams where the linen pieces join using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I set my needle all the way to the right and using the edge of the presser foot as a guide to line up with my previous lines of stitching, quilted repetitive lines echoing the shapes of the curves. This was one of those projects that took a lot longer than I initially imagined, but as I was making it, I was constantly impressed with the look of the quilted details. I would lay the pieces out on the floor and admire the progress. I was getting more and more excited to see the end result. Here I'm sewing the final lines of quilting. Alright, I've finished all of the quilting. I'm so happy with the way that this is looking right now. It was a lot of quilting. I was kind of thinking as I was doing it that each of these quilted lines is kind of equivalent to sewing a seam. So with the amount of sewing on this thing, I probably could have put together like 10 or 12 shirts. But I think it looks really amazing and I cannot wait to see how it turns out when it's all put together. So I'm really excited to start assembling this jacket. To assemble the jacket, I start by placing the front panels on the back panel with right sides together. I then sew along the shoulder seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, it's time to attach the sleeves. I clip them in place, right sides together, and sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The jacket is really starting to take shape. Next, I finish off the raw edges with bias binding. Then I lay the pieces right sides together, making sure to line up the colors as well as I can. I then sew along the sleeve and side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And this is what my jacket looks like inside out. I finish off the remaining raw edges with bias binding, then I pin bias binding around the outer edge of the jacket and sew it in place. The jacket is so close to being finished. All I have to do is install the snaps. I'm using a large sewing needle to start a hole through the fabric, then inserting a knitting needle to expand the hole. This creates a space that is just big enough to insert the snap hardware without having to risk cutting into the fabric. I then hammer the snaps together. And my quilted jacket is finished. Let's see how it turned out. I'm so impressed with this quilted jacket. I think it is one of the most elaborate and probably one of the nicest things I've made. The colors go beautifully together, and I love the organic curved shapes. The jacket is nice and warm and feels great to wear. I'm going to be getting a lot of use out of this as we transition from winter into spring weather. Oh, and in case you thought this jacket didn't have pockets, I've got a surprise for you. I added an inner pocket with a smaller decorative pocket that I sewed out of scraps from the curved pieces. The larger pocket is salvaged from a failed pair of pants that I made a while ago, and its companion is the pocket that I used in my marsupial shirt. I've now used up the majority of the material from that failed project and incorporated it into things that I'll actually wear. It feels great to use up materials that I already had on hand and create something that I'm really happy with. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot to me if you'd give it a like, and subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see more sewing videos like this one. I'll see you next time. Bye!